He found out his wife's baby wasn't his own. So he did something shocking that made her regret cheating forever. It all started at a small party John and his new wife, Mary, organized to entertain their friends shortly after their wedding. So, let's start from the beginning. John adjusted the grill as the smell of suya wafted through the air. His wife, Mary, laughed nearby, her voice light and easy, as she handed out bottles of beer to their friends. They were entertaining a few of their friends who had come to visit them after their wedding ceremony. Everyone said they were the perfect couple. John, with his easy smile and steady hands, was the perfect match for Mary with her sharp wit and bright eyes. Even their neighbors stopped by regularly to compliment them. But as the night wore on, John started noticing something. Mary kept glancing at her phone, her fingers tapping the screen quickly before she slipped it back into her pocket. Once, she excused herself to take a call, walking far enough away that her words were lost in the hum of conversation. John watched her, his smile faltering for just a moment. "Everything okay?" he asked when she returned. "Of course," she said, her voice smooth. "Just work stuff. You know how it is." He nodded, but the answer didn't make sense to him. Work stuff? At 9 p.m. on a Saturday? Later, as they cleaned up, Mary hummed softly, stacking the clean plates with practiced ease. John wiped down the table, his eyes drifting to her phone on the counter. It buzzed once, then twice. She snatched it up before he could say a word. "Who's texting you this late?" he asked, trying to sound casual. "No one important," she said with a light tone while avoiding his eyes. "Just a friend." He wanted to press her, to ask which friend, but she was already walking away, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. John stared after her. As he pulled his phone from his pocket, he noticed a small crack in the screen catching the light. The crack was not there before, but now that he had noticed it, that was all he could think about. He traced the jagged line with his thumb as he watched Mary disappear into the bedroom. He felt his chest tightening, quiet but persistent. The next morning, John woke to an empty bed. He reached for Mary's side, the sheets cool under his hand. He thought she had gotten up early to prepare for church, but then, the faint sound of her voice drifted in from the balcony. He sat up, rubbing his eyes, and listened. Her words were low, almost a whisper, but he caught snippets. "Not now, be careful later." He got up quietly, padding to the balcony door. Mary stood with her back to him, her phone pressed to her ear. She was dressed in her robe, the morning light catching the edges of her figure. She didn't notice him at first, her voice rising slightly. "I said not now. He's still here." John froze. "He? Who was he?" Mary turned suddenly, her eyes widening when she saw him. She ended the call quickly, her smile too bright. "Good morning, darling," she said, slipping her phone into her pocket. "I didn't wake you, did I?" "No," he said, his voice steady despite the knot in his stomach. "Who were you talking to?" "Just a friend from work," she said, brushing past him. "You know how it is. Always something to deal with." He wanted to believe her, but the way she avoided his eyes made his chest tighten again. He followed her to the kitchen, where she poured coffee into a mug. The steam curled lazily, but the warmth didn't reach him. "You sure everything's okay?" he asked, leaning against the counter. "Of course," she said, her tone light but her fingers tightening around the mug. Why wouldn't it be? He didn't have an answer, but the question lingered in the air between them, heavy and unspoken. That night, John sat on the couch, the TV playing softly in the background. Mary was in the bedroom, her voice low as she talked on the phone again. He tried to focus on the news, but his eyes kept drifting to the closed door. The faint hum of the fridge filled the silence, a sound he'd never noticed before but now couldn't ignore. When she finally came out, her phone in hand, he turned to her. "Who were you talking to?" She paused, her smile slipping for just a moment. "Just a friend from work," she said, her voice calm as she motioned for him to shift so she could sit beside him. "You've been talking to a lot of friends lately," he said, his tone sharper than he intended. She paused and her smile faded completely. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means you're always on the phone," always sneaking off to take calls. What's going on, babe? She crossed her arms, her expression hardening. You're being paranoid, John. It's just work. You know how busy I am. Work doesn't call early in the morning on Sunday, or at midnight for that matter, he shot back. She sighed, running a hand through her hair. I don't have time for this. If you don't trust me, that's your problem, not mine. She walked away, leaving him sitting there, the TV still murmuring in the background. He tried hard, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was going on, and it made his chest tighten even harder. The next few days were tense. Mary acted like nothing was wrong. She smiled brighter and laughed louder than ever before. It was silent torture for John, who tried hard to shake off his suspicions, but they clung to him like a shadow. He found himself watching her more closely, noticing the way she hid her phone when he walked into the room and the way she stayed up late, whispering into the night. One evening, as they sat at the dinner table, he brought it up again. Mary, we need to talk. She looked up from her plate, her expression calm. About what? About the phone calls and your secrecy in this relationship. I feel like you're hiding something from me, and it wasn't like that before we got married. She sighed, setting her fork down. Darling, you're being ridiculous. I've told you it's just work. I don't understand why you don't trust me. If you have trust issues, maybe that's something you need to work on. Her words stung, but they also made him doubt himself. Was he being paranoid? Was he the problem? I need to know that we're good and that I can trust you, he said, his voice quieter now. She reached across the table, her hand covering his. You can, darling. I promise. But her smile didn't reach her eyes, and the unease in his chest didn't go away. A week later, John found himself sitting in a small, dimly lit office. The man across the desk was older, his face lined with years of experience. John shifted in his seat, the leather creaking under his weight. So, you think your wife is cheating? The man asked, his voice calm but direct. John hesitated, then nodded. I don't know for sure, but something's not right. The man, Mr. Mike, leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled. We'll find out, but be prepared. Sometimes, the truth isn't what you want to hear. John nodded again, feeling a knot in his throat. He handed over a photo of his wife. Mr. Mike looked at the picture and then assured John that he would contact him when he was done investigating her. As he left the office, the weight of what he had done settled over him. It felt a lot like he was betraying Mary. He knew it was not right, but he convinced himself he had to find out exactly what was happening with his wife to prove that nothing was wrong and that he could trust his wife again. The days dragged on, each one heavier than the last. John tried to focus on work, but his mind kept circling back to Mary. The private investigator hadn't found anything yet, and John wasn't sure if that was a relief or a curse. He wanted answers, but he was also afraid of what they might be. One evening, Mary came home late, her face flushed and her eyes bright. She dropped her bag by the door and walked straight to the kitchen, where John was reheating leftover jollof rice. I have news, she said, her voice trembling with excitement. He turned to her, the spoon in his hand hovering over the pot. What is it? She took a deep breath, her smile spreading wide. I'm pregnant. For a moment, the world stopped. John stared at her, the words sinking in slowly. Pregnant. A baby. His baby. For a brief moment, the thought filled him with joy. He was going to be a father. But suddenly, the news felt like a weight pressing down on his chest. The doubts crept in, quiet and insistent. Was it his? Could he trust her? He still had doubts about his wife's fidelity, and it wouldn't be far-fetched to assume that the pregnancy was questionable. That's amazing, he said, forcing a smile. Are you sure? She nodded, her eyes shining. I took 3 tests. They're all positive. He set the spoon down and pulled her into a hug, his mind racing. A baby. Family. Mary pulled back, her hands resting on his shoulders. Aren't you happy? Of course I am, he said, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. This is everything we've wanted. But as she turned back to the food, her smile still glowing, John couldn't shake the unease. He instinctively reached into his pocket and traced the crack in his phone screen. The jagged line, a reminder of the cracks in their marriage. The pregnancy brought a strange kind of calm to the house. Mary seemed happier, her laughter easier, her smiles more genuine. But John's suspicions didn't fade. If anything, they grew stronger. He noticed the way she still hid her phone, the way she stayed up late, whispering into the night. He still woke sometimes to find her side of the bed empty. He'd tiptoe around the house only to find her in the bathroom or the living room. One night, found her on the balcony, her voice low and urgent. "I told you we have to be careful," she was saying. "He's getting more suspicious." John froze, his heart pounding. Who was she always talking to? And what did they have to be careful about? He stepped back before she could see him, his mind racing. The next morning, he called the private investigator. "Anything yet?" he asked, his voice tight. "Not yet," Mr. Mike said. "But I'm working on it. These things take time." Time? John didn't know how much more time he could take. But he was in it for the long haul. Whatever was going on, he was determined to find out. The months passed in a blur of doctor's appointments and baby preparations. Mary glowed, her belly growing round and full. John tried to share in her joy, but the doubts never left him. He still noticed the usual patterns that made him suspicious from the start. The way she still hid her phone and the way she avoided his questions. When the baby finally arrived, it was in the middle of the night. John drove Mary to the hospital, speeding through the busy traffic like an expert driver. The delivery was quick, and soon they were holding their son, his tiny face scrunched up in sleep. John stared at the baby, his heart swelling with love and fear. The baby didn't look like him. His skin was lighter, his features softer. Mary noticed him staring and smiled. "He's perfect, isn't he?" she said in a soft voice. "Yeah," John said, his voice thick. "Perfect." But the doubts gnawed at him, quiet and relentless. He held the baby close, his mind racing. Was this his son? Or was this the proof he'd been dreading? A week later, John found himself standing in a small clinic, holding a plastic bag that contained a few strands of hair from the baby's head. The nurse on duty took the sample from him and gave him a form to fill out, and now all he had to do was wait for the results. He felt like a traitor, but he couldn't shake the need to know. Mary had no idea. She thought he was at work, and he planned to keep it that way. He nervously traced the crack in his phone screen with his thumb, eagerly waiting for any shred of proof to confirm his suspicions. The nurse called him back, her face unreadable. "The results will be ready in a few days," she said. "We'll call you." He nodded, his throat tight. A few days. He could wait that long. He had to. The call came on a Thursday afternoon. John was at work, his phone buzzing in his pocket. He stepped outside, the sun warm on his face, and answered. "Mr. John?" The voice on the other end asked, sounding light and professional. "Yes, it's me," John said. "We have the results of your DNA test, sir." The voice continued. John's heart pounded. "And..." There was a pause. Then the voice continued, calm but firm. "The DNA samples we tested did not match." The world tilted. John leaned against the wall, his legs weak. The words echoed in his mind, over and over. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "We're sure," the voice said. "You'll get the test results when you come to the clinic." John hung up, his hands shaking. He stared at the phone, the truth sinking in. Mary had lied. The baby's DNA did not match with his own, and that only meant one thing. The baby wasn't his own. And now he had to decide what to do next. John got home that evening but couldn't muster the strength to get out of the car and enter the house. As he sat there in his car with the engine off, staring at the house, the baby's cries drifted through the open window, sharp and piercing. He gripped the steering wheel. The call from the clinic played over and over in his mind, a constant reminder of the truth. The baby wasn't his. Mary had lied. She had cheated. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He needed a plan. He couldn't just walk away. Not yet. He had to get his lick back on Mary, and he had to make it hurt just as much as she had hurt him. Since she cheated on him, he was going to do the same thing to her, but worse. His mind raced as he thought of who he could have an affair with that would hurt Mary the most. He thought about Mary's sister, Grace. Young, naive, and always looking at him with a hint of admiration. He thought about her friends. Linda, confident and sharp-tongued, and Helen, quiet but always watching. They were close to Mary. They trusted her, and they would be his way in. John started the car, his mind racing. He would make Mary pay. He would destroy her life, just as she had destroyed his. But he would do it quietly, carefully. He would make sure she never saw it coming. Grace sat on the couch, her legs tucked under her, scrolling through her phone. She looked up when John walked in, her face lighting up with a smile. "Hey, John," she said, her voice warm. "What brings you here?" He forced a smile, holding up a bag of groceries. "Mary asked me to drop these off. She's been so tired lately." Grace nodded, her expression softening. "The baby's keeping her up all night. It's tough." John set the bag on the counter, his eyes scanning the room. It was small but cozy, with photos of Grace and Mary on the walls. He noticed one of them laughing, their arms around each other. The sight made his chest tighten. "How are you holding up?" he asked, turning to Grace. She shrugged, her smile fading. "It's been hard. Work's been crazy, and Mary's been so busy with the baby. I feel like I barely see her anymore." John nodded, his mind working. Grace was lonely. She missed her sister, and she trusted him. "You know," he said, his voice gentle, "if you ever need someone to talk to, I'm here." She looked up at him, her eyes wide and grateful. "Thanks, John. That means a lot." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. The plan was already forming in his mind. John met Grace for coffee a week later. She looked nervous but excited, her hands wrapped around her cup. They talked about work, about Mary, about the baby. Grace opened up easily, her words spilling out in a rush. "I just feel like no one understands," she said, her voice trembling. "Mary's always been there for me, but now, it's like she doesn't have time for anyone but the baby." John reached across the table, his hand covering hers. "I get it," he said, his voice soft. "It's hard when someone you love pulls away." She looked at him, her eyes filling with tears. "You're the only one who gets it." He squeezed her hand, his mind racing. This was it, the first step. They met again the next week and the week after that. Each time, Grace grew more comfortable and more trusting. She laughed at his jokes, leaned in when he spoke, and looked at him with something like admiration. John played his part perfectly, his smile easy, his words kind. One evening, as they walked to her car, she turned to him, her face flushed. "John, I think I like you." He paused, his heart pounding. This was it, the moment he'd been waiting for. "I like you too," he said, his voice steady. "But we have to be careful. Mary can't know." Grace nodded, her eyes wide. "I won't tell anyone, I promise." He kissed her then, his hands gentle but his mind cold. The first step was done. Now on to the next target. Linda was harder to crack. She was sharp, confident, and didn't trust easily. But John was patient. He started small with compliments about her work and asking for her opinion. She brushed him off at first, but he didn't give up. One evening, he ran into her at a bar. She was alone, her phone in her hand, her expression distant. He sat down beside her with an easy smile that screamed, "You can trust me." "Rough day?" he asked. She looked at him, her eyes narrowing. "What are you doing here?" "Same as you," he said, holding up his drink. "Trying to forget." She snorted, but there was a hint of a smile. "Good luck with that." They talked for hours, the alcohol loosening her tongue. She told him about her ex, about how he'd cheated on her, about how she'd sworn off men ever since. John listened, his expression sympathetic. "You deserve better," he said, his voice soft. "Someone who sees how amazing you are." She looked at him, her eyes searching his face. "You're not so bad yourself, John." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. The second step was almost done. Linda started texting him after that. First it was just casual, how was work, how was Mary, how was the baby? But soon, the messages grew more personal. She told him about her day, her dreams, her fears. John responded carefully, his words kind but calculated. One day, she called him, her voice trembling. "Can you come over? I don't want to be alone." He called Mary to inform her that he would be a little late as there was an emergency in the office. Then, he went to Linda's without hesitation. She opened the door, her face pale, her eyes red. She didn't say anything. She just stepped into his arms. He held her, feeling her soft skin in his arms. "I'm here," he said, his voice soft. "You're not alone." She looked up at him, her eyes filled with tears. "Thank you, John. I don't know what I'd do without you." He kissed her then, and they took it as a cue to lay their emotions bare. Linda confessed she had fantasized about that moment ever since Mary introduced him as her partner. John told her what she wanted to hear, and they spent the next few hours passionately exploring each other's bodies. The second step was done. Now on to the next. Helen was the quiet one. She didn't talk much, but she watched everything. John had noticed her at family gatherings. Her sharp eyes and her polite smile always felt distant. She was married, but he'd heard the rumors. Her husband was rarely home, and when he was, they fought. Loudly, John started small. He complimented her cooking at a dinner party. His tone casual, but his eyes lingering. She blushed with a dry smile, but didn't say much. He made a point to sit next to her, to ask about her work, and to listen when she spoke. She opened up slowly, her words careful but her eyes softening. One evening, he ran into her at the market. She was alone, her basket full of groceries. He offered to help carry them, his smile easy. "You're always so kind," she said, her voice soft. "Just trying to help," he replied, his tone light. They walked to her car together, the sun setting behind them. She hesitated before getting in, her eyes meeting his. "Thank you, John. You're different." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I try to be." She drove off and he stood there, his mind racing. The third step was almost done. John juggled his affairs carefully. Grace texted him constantly, her messages filled with hearts and smiley faces. Linda called him late at night, her voice soft but urgent. Helen started reaching out too, her words hesitant but her tone warm. He responded to each of them, his words kind but his mind cold. Mary noticed the changes. She saw the way Grace smiled at her phone, the way Linda seemed lighter, the way Helen avoided her eyes. She brushed it off, what was wrong with her friends and sister finally getting some love in their lives. She thought. One evening, as they sat on the couch, Mary turned to John. "Have you noticed anything strange lately?" He looked up from his phone, his expression calm. "Strange how?" She hesitated, her fingers twisting in her lap. "Grace has been acting weird, and Linda, she's been distant. I don't know. Maybe I'm imagining things." He reached over, his hand covering hers. "You've been stressed. It's probably nothing." She nodded, but her smile didn't reach her eyes. "Yeah, probably." He went back to his phone, his mind racing. The web was tightening. She was starting to notice, but it was too late to stop now. Grace's text came late one night. "We need to talk." John's heart pounded as he called her, his voice steady. "What's wrong?" She was crying, her words stumbling over each other. "I'm pregnant, John. I don't know what to do." He froze, his mind racing. This wasn't part of the plan, but maybe it could work. "It's going to be okay," he said, his voice soft. "We'll figure it out." She sniffled, her voice trembling. "You're not mad." "Of course not," he said, his tone gentle. "We'll get through this together." She cried harder, her relief palpable. He held the phone to his ear, his mind cold but his words kind. The first part of his revenge was complete. Now on to the next. Linda found out about Grace's pregnancy a week later. She called John, her voice sharp. "What the hell is going on?" He paused, his mind racing. "What do you mean?" "Grace is pregnant," she said, her tone accusing. "And she won't say who the father is. But I know it's you." He took a deep breath, his voice calm. "Linda, it's not what you think." "Then what is it?" she demanded. "Are you playing us?" Is this some kind of game? He hesitated, then sighed. It's complicated, but I care about you. You know that, right? She was silent for a moment, her breathing heavy. I don't know what to believe anymore. Just trust me, he said, his voice soft. Please. She hung up without another word, and he stared at the phone. The second part of his revenge was almost done, but he had to be careful. One wrong move and it could all fall apart. Helen's husband found out about the affair a month later. He stormed into the house, his voice loud and angry. John heard the fight from the street, the sound of breaking glass and raised voices. He stood there, his hands in his pockets, his mind cold. The next day, Helen called him, her voice trembling. He knows. He's leaving me. John sighed, his tone sympathetic. I'm sorry, Helen, but maybe it's for the best. She cried, her words stumbling over each other. I don't know what to do. I feel so lost. You'll get through this, he said, his voice steady. You're stronger than you think. She sniffled, her voice soft. Thank you, John. I don't know what I'd do without you. He hung up, his mind racing. The third part of his revenge was complete. Now on to the final step. Later that week, Mary leaned over the kitchen table one evening, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea that had long gone cold. The baby slept in the next room, his soft breaths barely audible over the hum of the fridge. She stared at her phone, her mind racing. Something was off. Grace had been distant lately, her smiles forced, her eyes avoiding Mary's. Linda had stopped returning her calls. And Helen looked like she hadn't slept in weeks. Mary scrolled through her messages, her fingers trembling. She had texted all three of them, asking if everything was okay. Only Grace had replied, her message short and vague. Just busy. Talk later. Mary set the phone down, her chest tight. She thought about John, about the way he'd been acting lately. He was always on his phone, always slipping out to take calls. Once, she'd caught him whispering in the hallway, his voice low and urgent. When she asked who he was talking to, he'd brushed her off. Just work stuff, he'd said, his tone light but his eyes avoiding hers. She stood up, her tea forgotten, and walked to the window. The street outside was quiet, the sun dipping low behind the houses. She paced back and forth, her mind racing. Was she imagining things? Or was something really wrong? Mary couldn't take it anymore. She sought out a private investigator and scheduled an appointment. As she sat in the investigator's small, dimly lit office, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, the man across the desk, Mr. Daniel, was older, his face lined with years of experience. He leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled. So, you think your husband is cheating? He asked, his voice calm but direct. Mary hesitated, then nodded. I don't know for sure, but something's not right. Mr. Daniel nodded, his expression unreadable. We'll find out, but be prepared. Sometimes, the truth isn't what you want to hear. Mary handed over a photo of John, his smile bright and carefree. It felt like a betrayal, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. As she left the office, the weight of what she'd done settled over her. She felt stressed out, but she had to see this through and get undeniable evidence of his wrongdoings. A week later, Mary was back in the same office, her heart pounding. Mr. Mike slid a folder across the desk, his expression grim. I found something, he said, his voice steady, but it's not what you're expecting. Mary opened the folder, her hands trembling. Inside were photos, John with Grace, their heads close together, their smiles easy. John with Linda, his hand on her arm, his expression soft. John with Helen, their bodies close, their eyes avoiding the camera. Mary's chest tightened, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. She flipped through the photos, her mind racing. John, her husband, with her sister, with her best friend, with Helen. Are you sure? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Mr. Daniel nodded. I'm sure. I'm sorry. Mary closed the folder, her hands shaking. She felt the unease in her chest like a crushing weight. She stared at the folder, the truth sinking in. John had lied. He had cheated. With her sister. with her friends. And now she had to decide what to do next. Now back at home, Mary sat on the couch, the folder in her lap, her mind racing. The baby slept in the next room, his soft breaths barely audible over the hum of the fridge. She thought about John, about the way he'd been acting lately, always on his phone, always slipping out to take calls, always avoiding her questions. She stood up, her hands trembling, and walked to the window. The street outside was quiet, the sun dipping low behind the houses. How long had this been going on? How long had he been lying to her? The front door opened, and John walked in, his smile easy. "Hey babe, what's for dinner?" Mary turned to him, her chest tight. "We need to talk." He paused, his smile fading. "About what?" She held up the folder, her hands shaking. "About this." He froze, his eyes widening. "What is that?" "You know what it is," she said, her voice sharp. "How long, John? How long have you been lying to me?" He took a step back, his expression shifting from shock to guilt. "Mary, I can explain." "Explain what?" she demanded, her voice rising. "That you've been sleeping with my sister? With my best friend? With Helen?" He didn't say anything, his eyes avoiding hers. His thumb traced the crack in his phone screen inside his pocket as he stood there. Mary stared at him, her chest heaving. "Get out." He hesitated, then nodded, his shoulders slumping. He turned and walked out, the door closing softly behind him. Mary stood there, the folder in her hands, the truth sinking in. John had lied. He had cheated. And now he was gone. Mary suddenly heard her baby crying, but she barely paid any attention to his cries. Her mind was elsewhere, replaying the confrontation with John over and over. The folder of photos lay on the couch, a constant reminder of the betrayal. She had kicked him out, but the anger still burned inside her, hot and unrelenting. She picked up her phone, her fingers trembling as she scrolled through her contacts. She needed to talk to someone, anyone, but who could she trust? Grace, Linda, Helen? They were all part of this. They had all betrayed her. She dialed Grace's number, her heart pounding. The phone rang once, twice, then went to voicemail. She tried again, but the result was the same. Linda didn't answer either. Helen's phone was off. Mary set the phone down, her chest tight. The baby was still crying, and she couldn't ignore him any longer. She went to pick him up and rocked him gently, her mind racing. What was she supposed to do now? She had no one but the baby. She was alone, completely alone. Elsewhere, John sat at his desk, the divorce papers spread out in front of him. He had drafted them himself, careful to make sure everything was in order. He would get the house. He would get the car. He would get everything. Mary would be left with nothing but the baby that wasn't even his. He picked up his phone, his fingers hovering over Mary's number. He hesitated, then dialed. She answered on the third ring, her voice cold. "What do you want, John?" "We need to talk," he said, his tone calm. "I have something for you." There was a pause, then a sigh. "Fine, come over." He hung up, his mind racing. This was it, the final step. He grabbed the papers and headed out the door. The house was quiet when John walked in. Too quiet. The baby was asleep in the nursery, his soft breaths barely audible over the hum of the fridge. Mary sat on the couch, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea that had long gone cold. She looked up when he entered, her expression unreadable. "We need to talk," John said, his voice steady. Mary set the mug down, her eyes narrowing. "Are you here to beg me to forgive you for cheating on me? Don't even think about it." He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out the DNA test results. Mary stared at the papers, her face pale. "What is this?" "You know what it is," he said, his tone calm but his chest tight. "It's the DNA test. The one I did after the baby was born." She didn't move, didn't speak. Her eyes stayed fixed on the papers, her hands clenched in her lap. John took a deep breath, his mind racing. He had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times. But now that it was here, he wasn't sure where to start. "The baby isn't mine," he said finally, his voice breaking on the last word. Mary flinched, her eyes darting to his face. "John, don't," he interrupted, his voice sharp. "Don't lie to me. Not again." She looked away, her hands twisting in her lap. The silence stretched between them, heavy and unrelenting. John stared at her, his chest tight. He had wanted this moment for so long. But now that it was here, he felt no satisfaction, only pain. "Why?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Why did you do it?" Mary didn't answer right away. She stared at the floor, her shoulders slumped. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, trembling. "I didn't mean for it to happen. It was a mistake." "A mistake?" John repeated, his voice rising. "A mistake is forgetting to pay a bill. A mistake is burning dinner. This is betrayal." She flinched again, her eyes filling with tears. I know it was wrong, but I was scared. I didn't know how to tell you. Scared." John's voice was sharp now, his anger bubbling to the surface. "You were scared? What about me, Mary? What about how I felt? You were ready to let me believe that baby was mine. You were ready to let me love him and raise him as my own. And all this time, you knew the truth." She didn't say anything, her tears spilling over. John stared at her, his chest heaving. He had wanted to hurt her, to make her feel even a fraction of the pain he had felt. But now, seeing her like this, he felt no satisfaction, only emptiness. "You want to know why I did it?" he asked suddenly, his voice cold. "Why I cheated on you with Grace, with Linda, with Helen. It was because of this." He slammed his hand on the DNA test results. "Because you lied to me, because you made me feel like I wasn't enough. So I made sure you felt the same way." She didn't flinch this time. Instead, she stared at him, her voice quiet but firm. "You think hurting me back fixes anything? You think sleeping with my sister, my friends, makes us even?" "No," he said, his voice steady but his hands trembling. "It doesn't fix anything, but it made you feel what I felt. And that was enough." She didn't say anything, her tears falling silently. John stared at her, his chest heaving. He reached into his pocket again and pulled out another set of papers. These were crisp and clean, no cracks or creases. He set them on the coffee table next to the DNA test results. "What's that?" Mary asked, her voice trembling. "Divorce papers," he said, his tone cold. "I'm done, Mary. I'm done with this. With us." Her eyes widened, her hands flying to her mouth. You're leaving me?" "Yes," he said, his voice steady but his hands trembling. "I'm done pretending. I'm done trying to fix something that's broken beyond repair." She didn't say anything, her tears falling silently. "I'll expect you to be out of this house by the end of the week," he said finally, his voice quiet but firm. She looked up, her eyes wide. "John, please, don't," he interrupted, his voice sharp. "Don't try to stop me. It's over, Mary. There's nothing left to say." He turned and walked out, the door closing softly behind him. Mary sat there, her tears falling silently, the DNA test results and divorce papers side by side on the coffee table. The baby's soft cries jolted her out of her thoughts as she got up to go attend to him. Thank you for watching this video, guys. If you liked it, please subscribe and drop a comment below. See you in the next story soon.